In this video, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of technologies, and I think you're going to learn a lot. I'm running a 3CX PBX or private branch exchange or private phone system within a virtual machine on this laptop. So in this example, I've got a 3CX virtual machine running locally within Hyper-V, again on this laptop. I've also got two phones running the 3CX app, which have registered locally to this server, as well as hard phones or physical phones. So as an example, I could dial a number, let's say 1001, press call. Notice it rings here and on that phone, and I can press answer to answer the call. I could press hold to hold the call. You may be able to hear that music is playing on that phone. I could resume the call and then end it. These two phones are registered to this virtual machine, this 3CX server, and I can make calls between these two phones. But I can do a lot more than that. I've also got a PF Firewall over there connected to a switch providing power over Ethernet to these phones. So both these phones are powered by that switch. But what I've done on that PF Firewall is open up ports, and I'll show you how to set this up so that I can make and receive calls. I've also registered a telephone number in the US, which costs me only $1 a month. So I've got this telephone number, direct inward dial or DID telephone number, costs $1 a month, and I can call that number, which should ring on this phone. So what I'm going to do now is phone my USA number from this phone, which has a UK telephone number. So I'll phone that number. And what you'll notice on this phone is I'm receiving a call from a UK telephone number, which I can now answer. So I could put that on hold again. And hopefully you can hear that. Music on hold is now being played from this laptop through the internet to this phone. And as an example, I could press resume. We get some feedback there, so I'll turn the mic off. But notice again, if I press hold, music is playing, and that music is being sent from this laptop through the internet from the local PBX. In other words, my 3CX system to this phone in the UK, and I can end that call. So I have set up a trunk using CallCentric, a provider in the US that allows me to make and receive phone calls from our local PBX or private branch exchange. I'll test an outbound call now. So I'll dial this number. And the phone is now ringing. I can answer that here. And again, you're getting feedback because the call was made from this phone to this phone. And I'll press hold here. And again, you can hear music. In that example, I actually dialed a US number because I'm only paying for North America basic calls here at $1.95 a month. So this phone has both a UK as well as a US telephone number registered to it. Now, I know people are going to say, David, you're cheating. So let's prove the point. So on Hyper-V, notice at the moment, I get dial tone. The VM is running. I'm going to pause it for the moment. So the VM is now paused. What you'll notice is these two phones are showing loading now. They can no longer connect to the server. I'll try and make a call just to one of the other phones here, 1001. Just hangs. Call can't be set up because the server is down. If I now resume the server, so start it back up again, what you'll notice is my phones are back again. So as an example, I could call 1002 and that now works. So I can make a call from that phone to this phone. And as an example, I can mute the line. So my phones are not registered to some system in the cloud. They are using this local VM running within Hyper-V on this laptop. I am able to make calls outbound. I'm able to receive calls from an external phone. So as an example, this phone is using Skype, and I can call into my phone system. I can make calls to my Skype number. I can make calls between these phones, etc., etc. So just to make the point again, I'll phone my US number from Skype. Phone rings here. I'll mute the line. Call is now being made from Skype to a US telephone number. My UK number is displayed here. I could transfer that call, let's say, to 1001. Answer it here and transfer the call. number is shown on this phone now. The call is made from that phone to this phone. And I could, as an example, press hold, and you can hear music on hold playing on this phone now. I could end the call, and the call is now ended. So there are quite a few things that you need to set up here. Firstly, you need to set up a virtual machine or a physical machine running 3CX. In my example, I prefer to use Linux. So I'm running Linux within Hyper-V on Windows. You can install 3CX directly on Windows if you prefer. You have to set up the 3CX system. In this example, I've got 3 telephone numbers, 1000, 1001, 1002. So as an example, I could ring 1000 here. That rings on that phone as well as on the laptop. So I could answer the call there. Call is answered and I could end the call. In this example, I'm using an app on my Android phones. You don't have to buy a physical phone. You could just use an app on an Android phone or an iPhone, or just run an app directly on your PC if you preferred. But this shows you that we have got physical phones as well as apps or virtual phones or soft phones if you prefer, connected to my 3CX server. So you need to set up a SIP trunk so that you can make and receive calls. You need to set up your physical phones if you have those. So this is a SIP phone as an example. I'll show you how to set those up as well as apps on your phone. You need to set up your firewall. So again, on my PFSense firewall over here, I have set up rules to permit SIP to my server. My server has this IP address, 192.168.0.200. So I've got a UDP rule allowing calls from the outside to my server. I've also allowed TCP, port 5060 and port 5061. And I've also allowed UDP ports, which are required for RTP, so the actual voice call and other call setup information. So you need to allow SIP and RTP to go through your firewall to the virtual machine or physical PC if you're using that, so that you can make and receive calls from outside your PBX or your private branch exchange or private phone system. Now, there are a lot of technologies covered in this video, but I'm hoping that you're going to learn a lot. In a previous video, I showed you how to set up 3CX in the cloud. Very easy to set that up. This is a lot more complicated, but allows you to run the 3CX PBX locally. Again, I'm running it in this example in Hyper-V directly on this laptop over here. Now, I really want to thank 3CX for sponsoring this video and supporting my channel and allowing me to show you how to set this up. There are a lot of steps here, lots of things that you need to configure, but I think it's a fantastic project. You're going to learn again about firewall rules. You're going to learn how to set up the PBX or private branch exchange. You're going to learn how to set up the SIP trunk so that you can make calls. Lots of stuff to configure. So enough talking. Let me show you how to set this up. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to download and set up 3CX on this Windows computer. To sign up, you can use my link in the video description. I'm going to sign up with an email here. So I'll put in my name and I'll put in my email address and click Let's Go. 3CX makes this process very, very simple. All we need to do now is put in our verification code. So I'll check my email for that code and I'll put in my code and click Submit. Now you have to put in some details, so like your name, your company name, your telephone number. You then need to tell 3CX how many users you're going to have on your system. So I'm going to specify 1 to 10. That'll allow us to set up an SMB solution. That's recommended if you're brand new to this. The problem with the SMB solution, or sort of the caveat, is that it has to be hosted in the cloud. You can't host it locally, but it's a great way to get started. But in the next step, I'll also show you how to set up a professional version, as that's what we're concentrating on doing here. We want to host it locally on this laptop. So we need to get a pro version, not a SMB solution. You need to create a password and you need to agree to the license agreement. And once we've done that, we are told that for deployments up to 10 users, we recommend using the 3CX SMB solution. This is a free solution and is a full pro version of 3CX that runs as a shared instance. If you require a dedicated instance, be aware you'll need a 3CS license, a hosted instance, tech support, alternatively an integration partner. The cost will be approximately $600 a year. Now, when I click Next, what it's going to do is set up the SMB solution, but we also want to set up the solution locally. So if you are totally new to 3CX, probably best that you set up the SMB solution. I'm not going to do that. I'm simply going to copy the URL to another browser window. And that gives me the option to either use 3CX hosted or self-hosted or on-prem. That's what I'm going to select here and click Next, because again, I want to run the install on my laptop. Now you need to specify the domain that you're going to use. Now in my example, because I'm based in the UK, I'll specify a UK domain. And then you need to specify a host name. So I'll just specify something here and click next. Just make sure that this is a easy to remember domain because that's important for your installation. So click next. You now need to select the number of digits needed for your extension numbers based on the number of users in your company. 30 of those extensions are reserved for the system. So choose carefully as this cannot be changed later. I'm going to specify that because that gives me a lot of options. You may perhaps only want to use 3 digits. 4 digits is overkill for a lab, but why not? I'm going to choose 4 digits because I like that, and I'm going to click next. Now we need to set our system preferences like your country and time zone. It's picked up where I am, so that's good. English UK prompts is what I want to use, so I'm going to click next. Just change that to the options for your specific setup. And now we just need to wait for the installation to be set up. Now the next step is we need to choose the platform. Now in my example, I'm going to use Hyper-V. So I'm going to select Linux. And what I can do now is select the download link to download the software to my computer. So as you can see there, it's downloading. It's about 600 meg in size. We're also told that we should read the installation guide. The installation guide is fantastic. This is the installation guide for 3CX Debian. Tells us about the installation requirements, VM performance requirements, etc. And I'll go through a lot of that as I go through the installation. We also need to download the configuration file. So I'm going to download that to my computer. That's an XML file that has our configuration. So you can see it says setup config XML. And then we can log in and manage our system using this URL, our username, and our password. Okay, so back in the installation guide, we told that 3CX has created a Debian Linux ISO to make installation faster and management easier. You must dedicate your Debian Linux instance to 3CX. Do not install other packages or change the configuration. Do not install system updates via the command line. We need to do this via 3CX. Any changes that you make to the system will make the installation unsupported. And that's fine for what we're doing. Next thing we need to do is check system requirements. You need at least 1 dedicated CPU or 2 virtual cores and 2 gig of RAM. If you're self-hosting your machine and your host is using a shared CPU, you need at least 2 cores. So we need 2 gig of RAM, 2 cores. We are told to look at the suggested hardware requirements, and I won't go through that, but bunch of information here with regards to hardware. Now we're told that 3CX can be installed in any hardware that runs Debian 12. If you want to do a bare metal install, ensure that the hardware works with Debian 12 and the hardware vendor will support you with any issues. 3CX cannot assist you if you have issues installing Debian 10 on bare metal hardware. We're also told not to configure a virtual network, a VPN interface, or TeamViewer VPN options on the 3CX host. Okay, step 2, check your VM platform requirements. 3CX is tested and supported as a virtual machine on these hypervisor platforms, so VMware ESXi, Microsoft Hyper-V, KVM 2.8, and Citrix 7.0 or higher. Now in my example, I'm going to use Hyper-V, so I'll just search for Hyper-V here. This laptop is running Windows 11 Pro, so I have Hyper-V, and what I can do here as an example is create a new virtual machine. Now, before we get to the installation, we're also told to check network and firewall requirements. On-prem installs are only supported on properly configured RFC 1918 private networks. In other words, these networks as listed here. This is important. You need to use a dedicated public IP address. Now, for a lab, it doesn't matter while you're using the lab, but just remember, you'd have to set up a new lab if your IP address changes. For a real installation, you need a dedicated public IP address. You also need to use split DNS, so that the 3CX fully qualified domain name resolves on both the internal and external network. And they give us a link to set up split DNS. We're told that if we set up 3CX on a machine behind a NAT device, it requires port forwarding. So we are also given guides to set up a firewall. So as you can see, there's a lot of prerequisites, a lot of stuff that we need to configure to get 3CX working. But now let's get to the installation portion, and I'll show you how to set up 3CX. It's not very difficult. But again, the documentation is very detailed, showing you step by step what you need to do. So I'm not going to go through the documentation. I'll just show you the steps visually. You can look at the documentation if you're interested. Now, I will say this. You're going to want to bridge your virtual machine to the local network. So I'm going to go to Virtual Switch Manager. And what I've done is created an external virtual switch. You can create one as an example by simply selecting external, create virtual switch, and then giving it a name. So test switch or something else. I've already got one created here. So I'm not going to create this one. I'm going to simply click cancel, but you would bridge that to your specific network adapter. So which network adapter are you going to bridge it to? I've got 2 in this laptop at the moment. In my example, I've bridged this to the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet adapter. So I'll click cancel. But notice that I have got a external virtual switch configured so that I can bridge the virtual machine to the local network rather than using NAT. Okay, so I'm going to go to Action, New, Virtual Machine. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to call this 3CX Demo 5. Give it a name that makes sense, but that's good enough for this demonstration in my example. So I'm going to click Next. Select the generation of virtual machine. You're going to want to use generation 1. That's the recommended option, so I'm going to leave that as the default and click Next. Specify the amount of RAM. Remember, the requirement is at least 2 gig of RAM. So 4 is fine in my example. Networking. I'm going to bridge this to my external virtual switch, which I've created. I'm going to click Next. Specify the amount of disk space that you're going to use. In the documentation, we're told that we need at least 30 gig of disk space. So I've got enough disk space. We need to have 1 gig interface, and we need to have enough RAM and CPU. I've already discussed that. So let's go back to our virtual machine. I'll just make this 130 and say Next. We are going to install the software from an ISO image. So I'm going to browse to my downloads directory. This is the latest image that was downloaded. So I'm going to select that and click Open, and I'm going to click Next. And here's a summary of our virtual machine. And I'm going to click Finish. Virtual machine is now being created. So just to confirm the details, I'll right click and go to settings. That's the amount of memory that we've got. In my example, I've got a lot of virtual processors, so 11 in this case. Remember, you need at least 2. So I'm just going to leave that and click OK, and then click Connect. We're told that the machine is turned off, so I'm going to click Start to start it up. And now we need to select the option to install 3CX. So I'm going to press Enter to install the software. Installation starts. Okay, so this is important. You need to use a static IP address. So I'm not going to select the host name. I'm going to go back and select the network manually. And I'm going to specify an IP address in my example of, let's say, 192.168.0.200. You would use a RFC 1918 address in your subnet. So your address won't be exactly the same as mine, but that's fine for my example. Specify the subnet mask. By default, it's a /24 mask, so 255.255.255.0. Continue. The default gateway in my example is 192.168.0.1, so that's fine. Press Continue. DNS server in my example is 192.168.0.1. Remember, we need to use split DNS, so make sure that you use the correct DNS server. So I'm going to say Continue. Hostname, I'll just say 3CX Demo 5 and Continue. Domain name, I'll just specify a domain name. So that would be, per the documentation, something like mycompany.com. And press Continue. Specify your language. In my example, it's going to be English. I'll use United States, American English. Now you need to specify a root password. Make sure that you use a good password. Now we need to partition our disks. We're going to use guided partitioning in this example. I'm going to partition the entire disk. That's the disk that we're going to partition. And I'm going to put all files in a single partition. I'm going to finish partitioning and write the changes to disk. Press Tab to say yes to make those changes. And now the software is being installed. So quite a simple installation. The big thing to remember is you need to specify a static IP address. So you have to go back and change it from using DHCP to static IP address. Remember your DNS server, you have to use split DNS, so that needs to be configured correctly, and use a good password. Software is now being installed. Now you need to make a decision. Are you installing the 3CX system, which is what we're doing, or the 3CX SBC? So in my example, I'm going to go with OK because I want to install the system. And as you can see now, the system is now being installed. Okay, so we have to agree to the license agreements. So I'm going to press OK. And the system is now rebooting again, booting into Debian GNU Linux. We're now given the option to configure the 3CX server using a web browser or from the command line. I'm going to select 1 to use a web browser. And we're now given the URL to use to get to our server. So in a web browser, we need to go to HTTP 192.168.0.200, port number 5015 in our example. So 192.168.0.200, 5015. And we're told that we can restore a backup or upload a new configuration file created on 3CX. So that's what we did previously. So I'm going to click Next, click Upload, find my setup config file, which we previously downloaded, and click Open. Configuration is now being uploaded, and we're told waiting for the activation server to start processing your fully qualified domain name. And you just need to wait now for this process to complete. May take a few minutes. As you can see, the process is continuing, and we now told, congratulations, your 3CX installation is ready. Information is shown here, so I could copy this information and save that somewhere. We also told that we can click here to set a password. I'm going to continue to my domain. Now, in my example, it's not working because I haven't set up my DNS properly. So what I'm going to do is just go to the local IP address and specify my new password to get that set up. We are told that 3CX requires a secure connection to use the web client. You're not using a fully qualified domain name or HTTPS to connect to 3CX. So I'm using HTTPS, but not a fully qualified domain name. I'm okay with that. I'm going to change the password, and now I can log in. So I'll specify my email, and I'll specify my password and click Login. And there you go. You can see that my system is now set up. Again, we're not using the fully qualified domain name, which we should be using. But as an example, we can set up a telephone number here. But as you can see here, we could set up a phone. But before I do that, I'm going to sort out the problem with the domain because my domain hasn't been configured properly. I need to set up split DNS as they show you here in step 6, configure split DNS. So we told you need to configure the 3CX fully qualified domain name to work both internally on your local network and externally outside of your network. We can read how to configure split DNS using this link, and we told how to configure split DNS, NAT loopback, or hairpin NAT for on-premise installs, how to make a fully qualified domain name that resolves internally and externally, and then we have the configuration options on different firewalls. So as an example, we've got Sonic Wall, pfSense, WatchGuard, Fortinet, and Cisco options. And then they show us how to do it on a Microsoft DNS server. So again, in step 6, we need to configure the 3CX fully qualified domain name, and we've got information on how to do that. Now, in my example, I'm using a pfSense firewall. It's actually right here. So I've moved it here so we can use it as part of the lab. So I need to configure the pfSense firewall for DNS resolver. And again, they show us how to do that here through the documentation. I'm not going to do it that way. I'm simply going to show you how to do this. It's very easy. So what you need to do is go to Services, DNS Resolver, and scroll down, and we're going to add a host override. So I'm going to click Add. Now my host is my David Bombal demo host, and the domain that I'm using is my3cx.uk. The IP address that we're going to resolve this to is 192.168.0.200. That is, once again, the 3CX server running within Hyper-V. Now, before I set that up, notice what happens. If I do an NS lookup to my test server, it's resolving to a public IP address. It's not resolving to the local IP address right here. So I need to set it up to resolve to 192.168.0.200 for hosts that are internal in my network. Phones won't be able to register. I won't be able to access my server using the domain name internally unless I fix that. So in pfSense, I'll scroll down and click Save, and then I'm going to apply those changes. Okay, so that's successfully been applied. So it's as simple as that. Notice the difference now. Previously, that was resolved to a public IP address. Now it's resolving to 192.168.0.200. Local IP address, as we can see here within Hyper-V. Okay, so that's good. That means that using my local browser on the Windows computer, I should be able to browse to that server, and I'm able to do that. What I can do on my Android phone, as an example, is get it to register with the 3CX solution. Now, in this example, I'm going to connect it using physical Ethernet because I don't have a Wi-Fi access point connected to the pfSense firewall at the moment. So what I can do is go to the Play Store and search for 3CX, and I can click Install to install the software, and I can click Open, And what I can do now is agree to the license and then scan a QR code. So what I'll do on the 3CX server is show a QR code, and then I can simply scan that with the phone. And it says, hello, David Bomble. So I'll click continue and then allow notifications, etc. And notice I'm now connected. So I have a local phone connected to the 3CX system running within Hyper-V. So what I'll do now is go to admin, users, and I'll add a user with extension 1001. And I'll just say user 2 and I'll click save. So user 2 now has extension 1001. And I'll click on QR code to show the QR code. And what I can do on this phone, once again, is go to the Play Store, search for 3CX, and I can click install to install the app. And I can press open to open it up. Again, I need to agree to the license agreement, scan the QR code. So I'll simply scan that, press continue. And notice now I've got another user set up and I can ring David and press answer. And notice it was ringing on the computer as well as on the phone. I'll mute it so that we don't get feedback. But notice I've got a call now set up between these two phones. I'll end the call. And what I'll do now is go to contacts on this phone and select user 2. And then I'll call user 2. So I'll answer the call here. So I've got a call between these two. What I'll do is press hold. You might be able to hear that. Music on hold is now playing. And I could resume the call. Call is now set up between these two phones. I'll just mute this again for feedback. But there you go. I've got 3CX working now using two Android phones with the 3CX app. Again, I could go here and ring myself and answer the call on that phone. So we've now downloaded the ISO, installed it within Hyper-V. We have got the telephone system set up and we've got two users configured in our team. Both of them are available at the moment. I'm now going to show you how to set up a physical phone. This phone has been registered, but I'll reset it to factory defaults and then show you the full setup. This phone, as an example, can ring 1001. So this phone rings as well as that physical phone, and I can answer the call. I'll end it. So I previously created this user, which I'll now delete. And what I'll do now is factory reset this phone. So to reset a phone like this, what you've got to do is you've got to hold the speaker button down while you plug in the power. So I'll do that here. So I'll hold down the speaker button and then plug in the Ethernet cable. And then what should happen when that gets power is I should be able to reset it. So as you can see, it's now got power. And what we see on the screen, hopefully you can see that it says, do you want to enter recovery? And the answer is yes. So I'm going to say yes. So I've pressed 1 and notice the phone is rebooting, reset to factory defaults. That should register to our system. To get it to register, however, I need to add a user in my example. I'm going to add a user with the username user3. Telephone number is going to be 1002. And the phone that I'm going to configure in this example is a Yealink 48U. I can see that kind of information on the back of the phone. This is a SIP phone, Yealink T48U. And you need to put in the MAC address of the phone. So I've got that MAC address and I'm going to click next and connect it directly to the system. So the phone will hopefully register now automatically. The phone that's been configured as this phone with extension 1002 with the MAC address of the phone. Notice it says config updating. So it should automatically register. I've got a DHCP server running on my pfSense firewall, which is allocating IP addresses. So this phone should get an IP address and then automatically connect to the server. If it doesn't, you can open up a web browser to the phone and then specify the auto provisioning URL. I shouldn't have to do that. It should automatically register. On that phone at the top there, I had to manually specify the auto provisioning URL. So connect to it using a web browser and then specify the auto provisioning URL. I didn't have to do that with this phone. So your mileage may vary depending on which phone you're using, but hopefully in a second that phone will register. It's rebooting again, obtaining an IP address, hopefully should register shortly. Okay, and there you go. Hopefully you can see that it's telephone number 1002, user 3. On the 3CX solution, we can see that the user has now gone green. So the user is now available and I should be able to phone 1001. And there you go. I can make the call. I can answer the call, etc. On this phone, I can phone user 3, and there you go. I can answer the call and end the call. So it was as simple as that to get this phone working with the local installation of 3CX. Again, the 3CX server is running within a virtual machine within Hyper-V on this laptop. This is a Windows 11 laptop, and phones have registered. Now I can add extensions. So I've got this 1000 extension at the moment, but it doesn't help me setting up the system to make calls externally or receiving calls. We have to set up a trunk, but the problem with trying to do that is we need to configure our firewall in step 7. So in order to configure a SIP trunk or connect remote phones, you will need to configure your firewall to allow voice traffic in and out of your network. And then they give us a reference guide on how to set up your firewall. And one of the first things you need to do is run the firewall checker. So back in my 3CX application, I'll go to admin, and under dashboard, I'll click on firewall and click start to start the process. And what it does now is check if things are set up right. And you can see there are a lot of problems. Testing the 3CX phone system SIP server failed. And you can see a whole bunch of other things have failed here. So scrolling up to the top again, they tell us how to resolve this. So back in our firewall and router configuration, we need to allow ports for SIP. So ports 5060 as an example and 5061. We also need to allow ports 9000 to 10999 UDP ports for media, so for the actual voice. And if we want to allow WebRTC, we need to allow port 443. We're told that we need to open up these ports to allow 3CX to communicate with the VoIP provider or SIP provider. So 5060 in UDP, 5060 to 61 inbound TCP for SIP communications. These ports inbound UDP for RTP audio, which is the actual call traffic. Each call requires 2 ports, one to control the call and one for the call data. So the number of ports that you need is double the number of simultaneous calls that you have. If you've got an SBC, they show us the ports that are required here. So ports are listed as follows. If you want to use video conferencing, ports are listed here. And then there are other ports that would be required for other services. So scrolling down, we can see how to configure a pfSense firewall for 3CX. We have to configure port forwarding using NAT. We have to configure the split brain DNS, which we've done already. We have to configure HEP and NAT, and then we can validate our settings. Now, before we continue, be aware that you're opening up holes in your firewall. So there's a risk to doing that. People on the internet could have access to your 3CX server. You may want to block traffic from a specific IP address. So when you set this up, only allow a certain IP address to talk to you or a range of IP addresses. Okay, so on this pfSense firewall, what I've done is configure these ports to allow traffic in. The way you do that is you go to Firewall, NAT, and here you could add a rule. So in my example, let's say the protocol is UDP. I'm specifying the destination port range. I'm not specifying the custom port. I'm specifying the destination port. And you could specify a protocol here if you wanted to, but all I'm going to do is say 5060. So specify the destination port and then specify either the address or alias. So 192.168.0.200 as an example. The redirecting port number would be, say, 5060. So traffic received by the firewall going to port number 5060 is going to be redirected to my server on port 5060. And then I could save that. Now, in my example, I actually did that already. I already specified port 5060 going to 5060. So I don't really need an additional rule here. So I'll delete that. But that's essentially how you'd permit SIP, in this case, port 5060 UDP. If you want to specify a range of port numbers, you could do it manually, but it's much easier to create an alias. So under firewall aliases, we can specify IP addresses or port numbers. So what I've done here is create a 3CX server with my server's IP address. That means I don't have to specify the IP address every time when I create my NAT rules. I can simply search for 3CX as my alias. Now, under ports, I have created a SIP TCP alias as well as RDP. So if I edit the SIP TCP rule, notice I gave it a name, gave it a description, and then specified the type being port numbers, and I specified 5060 as well as 5061. So as an example, if I go back to aliases, ports, I could add one here, and I could simply give it a name, description again, specify the ports, and then let's say port 5060. So SIP 5060, add another port 5061, SIP 5061, and click save. And that's an alias I could use now. The same with 3CX RTP here. Here I've got a whole range of port numbers. So I have specified a range using a colon here. So 9,000 to 10,099. So again, on their documentation, ports required for your SIP trunk VoIP provider, SIP 5060 for UDP, 5060 to 61 for TCP, and then these port ranges for RTP. And then 443 if you want to allow web RTC. I haven't allowed that. I just wanted to get calls up and running. So now under Firewall NAT, notice as an example on the TCP one, the protocol is TCP. The destination port is my 3CX rules. If I start typing 3CX here, I can see the aliases that I've created. The server is the server that I created previously. I could have put an IP address in there rather than the alias. And the redirect target is that list of port numbers. So again, going back to port forward, there are my rules. You can see all the information shown here. I'm not specifying a source address and source port. If your VoIP provider uses specific IP addresses, you may want to lock this down to only those IP addresses. That's a lot more secure than just allowing anyone to access your system. So again, you need to allow your firewall to allow inbound calls. The next step is to set up your SIP trunk provider or your SIP service provider. And in my example, I'm using CallCentric. So in CallCentric, what I've done is I've paid for a DID or direct inward dial telephone number. This is the telephone number, costs $1 a month. And I've also paid for North America Basic, which allows me to make a certain number of telephone calls to American telephone numbers. Now, you have to specify the extension. So under View Modify Extensions here, I'm going to click Modify, and in 3CX, I would have to specify my username, so my SIP username, and my password. What I've also done on CallCentric is I've only allowed certain devices to make calls using this trunk. And that's the IP address of my 3CX system. That is the public-facing IP address. So only my 3CX server can make calls using CallCentric. What you've also got to do is on your 3CX system, you've got to go to voice and chat, and you've got to add a trunk. So in my example, I've already got that set up. I just gave it a name, CallCentric. I specified the main trunk number, the authentication ID, and the password. Now you've got to tell it where to send the call. So as an example, is it going to go to one of your users or is it going to go to a hunt group as an example? So I'll simply send the call to user 3 and save the trunk. That's all I had to do. And then I made sure that it registered to the CallCentric provider. You also need to specify outbound rules. So to make calls outbound, you need to tell the system, for instance, which telephone number or prefix to start with. So in my example, I said calls starting with a prefix of 0 are going to be sent to CallCentric. I've given it a name. This is not great. This is just a demo, so I haven't used good names. I'm routing it to CallCentric, and then I'm stripping off the first digit. So what I'll do here is make a call to my US telephone number, and notice it's ringing here, and I can answer the call. I'll mute it on the side so we don't get feedback. I could transfer the call to, let's say, 1001 and say blind transfer. Call rings here, and I can answer it, and notice the call is being received again, and I could end the call. So just to summarize, under voice and chat, you've got to add a trunk. On your trunk, specify the name, specify the default route, where you're going to send the call. Are you going to send it to a user, to a ring group? You're going to send it to a queue? What are you going to do with the call? In my example, I simply send it to this phone. You need to specify your trunk number, your authentication ID, and your password, and then you need to click save. For outbound calls, you need to create a rule, and you need to tell the system which digit, as an example, is going to be used to forward calls externally, and then are you going to strip that digit or not? So as an example here, I could dial 0 and then dial a telephone number. And this phone is now ringing. I've received that call. So I've been able to make a call from this phone externally. I'll just mute this so we don't get feedback. But notice, as an example, if I press hold there, you can hopefully hear some music. playing, and I could end the call on this phone, which ends the call on that phone. Okay, so in summary, what I'm doing is I'm running Hyper-V on a Windows 11 computer. I'm running the 3CX PBX or phone system as a virtual machine within Hyper-V. I am able to configure the 3CX system using my web browser. I've also got CallCentric set up as my SIP provider or trunk so that I can make calls externally and receive calls externally. I've also got 3CX app running on my phones here, as well as hard phones. Again, you don't need hard phones if you want to do this yourself. I've also set up my pfSense firewall to receive calls externally. Remember, you may want to restrict your source address so that only your SIP provider can make calls to your 3CX system. You want to be careful, again a warning, opening up ports on your firewall to allow calls or traffic into your network. You may want to set up this on a DMZ, set it up in a certain part of your network to reduce risk. But this is great practice for a lab. Allows you to learn how to set this up in the real world. I'm hoping that you've learned a lot and that you've learned now how to set up a telephone system locally at your home as an example or in an office. Remember, from a security point of view, try and lock things down as much as you can. You don't necessarily want to allow all these ports if you're only getting a few calls at a time, and you want to restrict the source address to your provider as much as you can. Okay, let me know in the comments. Did you learn something? Hopefully you did. I'm David Bombal, and I want to wish you all the very best.